Transboundary water issues have become sources of conflict in many regions of the world. In this context, water access is as much a political issue as it is a technical or environmental issue.
It will minimize the quantity of water comes to Egypt, and it will affect also for the regulation of when the water will come. They will be the master of the water in the area.
There is a large dependency on water for health, food production, and other economic activities. This, in combination with increasing demand for water and the changing climate, creates a larger threat for escalation of conflicts and tensions. Though the fight over water has a long history. Most likely, water conflict started in times when people started to settle along river basins to practice agriculture. This was approximately 7,000 years before Christ.
Also, our language shows the commonality of conflicts over water. The English word rivalry comes from the Latin word rivalis, which refers to the shared use of the same water.
It is not the water scarcity or pollution that usually causes conflicts. More often, water conflicts are caused by the social, economic, and political effects of scarcity and pollution. For example, people that lack access to water become ill, miss out on harvests, or cannot undertake economic activities. This can then lead to social and political unrest. Though a presence of latent conflicts, political instability, or economic drawbacks is inclined to escalate if there is a low quality or quantity of water. Thus, lack of access or availability of water can catalyze conflicts.
An example of a latent conflict is found in the northeast of Africa, the Nile Basin. Here, a deep-rooted relation exists between Ethiopia and Egypt, which has historically not been harmonious at all. Much of the relationship between Ethiopia and Egypt is deeply tied with the existence of the Great River Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world. With the length of more than 6,000 kilometers, it drains an area of approximately 3.5 million square kilometers, equivalent to about a tenth of the African continent. Flowing from Ethiopia to the delta in Egypt, the river is a source of life for the growing populations in the region. One can divide the 10 riparian countries into upstream and downstream. Ethiopia is the largest upstream country in terms of population and water contribution. On the other hand, Egypt largely depends upon the water coming from Ethiopia. It is generally agreed that without the Nile, there would be no Egypt, as it is dependent on the Nile for its agriculture, economy, and population.
If we talk about the dependency level, I think those countries are more located at the northern side of the watershed. So Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan are dependent.
The Ethiopian rivers contribute something like 85% of the water that flows into Egypt. You know, in terms of the changes that we're seeing in the Nile Basin at the moment, I think it's going through a critical phase.
If you're dependent on resources that are within your internal boundaries of your territory, like Ethiopia, you don't have that much vulnerability because it's your part of the watershed and it's within your boundaries of your national territory. But if you look at Egypt, that is actually relying on its 97% level of dependence of water resources that is not within its territory. So it's a huge level of vulnerability.
Historically speaking, power has played a very important role in the way in which Nile flows have been allocated in the past. Different treaties have been signed between the riparian countries, especially between Sudan and Egypt under British supervision during colonial times.
When that was the time of the Great Britain as a colonizer of Egypt and Sudan, they've been signing agreements. that were really putting the core of the power to Egypt mostly, and of course Sudan, because they were also having great allocations of water resources from the 1929-1959 agreements.
The two treaties signed in the last century, first when Egypt and Sudan were colonial possessions. In 1929, all the waters of the Nile were assigned to those two countries, and then that agreement was built upon by the independent nations Sudan and Egypt in 1959, and they again divided all the water between them, with Egypt getting something like 60% and Sudan getting something like 20%, and then the other 20% being assumed to be lost to evaporation. No upstream country was a signatory to either of those treaties, which allotted all the water to Egypt and Sudan in various forms. I think it's a pretty obvious, clear-cut case that is not a fair or equitable way to allot the water of the Nile. Egypt has traditionally dominated it. It has treaties which give it the supposed legal right to most of the Nile waters. It's discouraged upstream countries from using the Nile for irrigation or for hydroelectricity.
In 2011, Ethiopia began building the Grand Renaissance Dam. When completed in 2017, the dam will be the largest hydroelectric power plant in Africa and the 8th largest in the world.
If we just look at the Eastern Nile River, when we refer about power shifts, those have been huge in the last century even. Ethiopia in the 60s, when they were under the King Haile Selassie, they wanted to develop with a United States consultant a series of dams that would be way less important than the Great Renaissance Dam. But they have been blocked militarily, and not militarily, but by threats, we could say. And now they're just actually catching up on the development they couldn't conduct at that time. In the recent years, we had Ethiopia that was kind of waking up itself in the late 90s, thinking, wait, we have all these water resources within our territories, and we're kind of tired out of kind of slowing the process of our development by not using our water resources. So now they've been deciding that, okay, there's like kind of geopolitical problems within Egypt, and I can't say if it's a way of taking opportunity of their instability to build up their power on the water resources, but they've been starting to build up those hydropower dams, and now they slowly start to be the hydro-hegemon, as we refer in the field of hydropolitics.
For many Ethiopians, the dam is perceived as a symbol of progress and renewal after decades of economic stagnation and debilitating famines. The dam provides an opportunity for growth in the region, as Ethiopia is able to use the power generated by the dam and sell it to neighboring countries.
It's an important project for Ethiopia's development, and they should be able to, at some point in the future, produce plenty of excess electricity to export. Ethiopia is trying to assert itself economically more these days. It has a regional security role to play, and it is a significant military power. And it has, its troops are operating as peacekeepers in places like in Abyei and in Sudan and Somalia, and it's taken this assertive step to build a very large development, a very large dam.
So I think it's just logical that that Ethiopia is standing on their rights and saying, we've been suffering from starving in all the country, and now we want to build ourselves. We want to build ourselves economically and in education, and of course we don't have the support of the countries around us. Well, then we'll use consultants from the exterior, such as China or Italy, to build up our force nationally.
One can say that most people in the country are fully supportive of utilizing the Nile water for the benefit of Ethiopia, and that is because they believe that they have been historically excluded from their right to use the asset.
And I think Egypt is just wanting to, have this message that they're not ready to collaborate. They're not at this point, and they could see that they had this hydrohegemon role in the past that now they've been losing because they were so preoccupied of their internal civil situation, where you had the spring, the Arab Spring and the revolution, and now they have problems. They still have internal problems.
But further downstream, there are concerns about what the construction of these dams will mean for Egypt's long-term water security. Egypt has been very vocal about its opposition to the dam and has even threatened military action if construction goes ahead. But does this tension have potential to spill over into real conflict? Do Ethiopia's actions upstream represent an existential threat to Egypt? Is there a solution to be found?
And the real points of contention, as I understand it, is the rate which Ethiopia fills a very large reservoir, which will sit behind the dam, because obviously during that impounding process, the water that would be flowing downstream to Egypt is diverted to fill the reservoir. Egypt's concerns about that are quite valid. Ethiopia's planning and approach to that do not seem rigorous. They do not seem to have taken into account the potential for increasingly variable and therefore possibly less rainfall in the future, but because of climate change. And they generally seem to have an unrealistic idea of being able to fill the reservoir in a few years, which would mean a very significant proportion of the river's flow diverted into the reservoir during that period, causing potentially serious water shortages downstream in Egypt. Egypt's concerns do not, to me, seem as justifiable and reasonable. It is primarily a hydroelectric project, so the dam will not be consuming water. So if the project is managed in a reasonable and sensitive manner by Ethiopia, or ideally in partnership with Sudan and Egypt, then once the dam is operational, there is no reason that the flow to Egypt will significantly be reduced. If Ethiopia goes ahead with its project, which it very much intends to do, then Egypt is going to have to find a new way of dealing with this issue.
Nile riparian countries, and primarily Ethiopia, felt left out by the Nile River treaties between Sudan and Egypt. They then formed the Nile Basin Initiative that opts for equitable use of the Nile water.
It started from the World Bank initially, and it's not an initiative that was stemming from the national entities requiring this global effort. It came from an external actor that can, in Africa, be seen sometimes with imposing its way of doing. So I think the countries have been a bit cold by this initiative.
Once the treaty is ratified by six of the Nile Basin nations, then that should eventually lead to the creation of the Nile Basin Commission, which will plan and adjudicate on issues that arise in the basin. So it will be a mechanism to manage usage of the basin. In some respects, the Cooperative Framework Agreement and the Nile Basin Commission will be then the legally recognized instruments which govern the basin. But of course, you will still have the issue of Egypt and potentially Sudan. They will still remain major players in the Nile Basin. At the moment, they are not part of this new initiative. They are concerned that their historic rights to the majority of the river's waters that they have enjoyed will disappear once the new treaty and once the new arrangement comes into force.
The Nile Basin Initiative should build itself and reinforce the point that if we use the power assets from each respective national countries to build legitimacy of the policies and to build collaboration, that could actually help.
In that Egypt and at the moment Sudan do not want to become, are not showing signs they want to be part of a new cooperative management system for the river.
Climate models predict an increase in climate variability in Africa in the future as a result of climate change. It is likely that climate changes will manifest itself in more variability in the river's flow, which can lead to more common occurrences of droughts and floods. Also, more extreme weather events are expected.
But if we look in the future, whether they will keep on doing those kind of big messages, supporting the Nile Basin Initiative politically, but not necessarily in their actions, is kind of a hard bet to do.
Ethiopia is understandably very eager to become a wealthier country where less of its citizens live in poverty, and it has identified quite correctly the waters of the Nile as a major national asset that it's not tapped.
For example, of course, in Ethiopia you have all this hydropower force that is really there, that is present, and it's actually helping diminishing the evapotranspiration, because they can retain the water rather than the water evaporate. You have in Egypt big skill force. Those people are experts in hydropower, they are experts in irrigation, in water resources, so this can be used to. And if you look at Sudan, they have irrigation capacity that is really important. So all this can be used together to shape a different reality, an original reality rather than respective national realities.
The populations of the riparian countries are growing, which increases the pressure on the Nile as a resource. This demonstrates the importance of establishing effective transboundary water management regimes to deal with the increased pressure. How the story of the Nile River Basin will continue remains to be seen.